I'm heading out today, so please take care of the house. Here's the key. I was sick of my mother-in-law Megan's habit of dumping household chores on me like this. I asked my husband Richard to speak to Megan about it, but she managed to win over my father-in-law Brian with her crocodile tears, making the family accept that it's okay to pile chores on me. And you still haven't cleaned the bathroom. I wanted to shower before Brian gets back. Hey, I'm tired. Give me a massage. She started treating me like a housekeeper. While massaging Megan, I realized something. That's when I started planning to kick her out. I'm Christina, 24 years old. I've been a housewife since marrying Richard 2 years ago. I always dreamed of this lifestyle and was quite happy with it. Richard, whom I met in a college club, was surprisingly mature and cool for his age. He was initially quiet but turned out to be just shy. After a few group hangouts, he started talking to me. We found a lot in common, from hobbies to food preferences, and quickly became friends. Before long, we were hanging out alone more often than with our friends. He promised to me on my birthday in our junior year of college. We were dining in a somewhat fancy restaurant when I mentioned, "I'm 21 now, I should start thinking about a job." Richard's proposal was, "Well, why don't you work for me?" Knowing my dream was to be a housewife, Richard promised to work hard so that my dream would come true. We got engaged in college, but living together would wait until after graduation. That was the condition set by my parents. We used our savings from part-time jobs along with money our parents had set aside for our wedding. We decided not to rely on our parents for our new life, so we rented a small apartment we could afford on Richard's starting salary. The apartment was small and a bit far from the station, but married life was fun. Preparing breakfast and sandwiches for Richard, welcoming him home, having dinner, and sleeping together in our small bed were all enjoyable. Still, at that time, I wished for a slightly better life. Looking back, maybe we were happier living just the two of us. Everything fell apart 6 months ago. Richard's parents lived in New Orleans due to his father Brian's job, while Richard, my parents, and I lived in Boston. Brian got transferred back to Boston and they suggested buying a two-family home. Thinking, parents-in-law were in their 50s, healthy, and had no chronic illnesses. I accepted the offer thinking it wouldn't affect our lifestyle much. Living in a two-family home will be much better than directly sharing a space, I thought, and welcomed the idea. Brian had a well-paying job, so money wasn't an issue. Brian took care of most of the mortgage payments. For Richard, it was just like paying the rent we had always paid. So we were delighted to move into a bigger, detached house without changing our budget. We hadn't spent much time with Richard's parents, who always lived in New Orleans. We only met them at family gatherings or weddings. Despite this, we had high hopes, thinking, they're Richard's parents, they must be good people. Little did we know about Megan's challenging personality. We renovated a pre-owned duplex and were able to move in about 3 months after the in-laws suggested it. We moved in mid-December. Due to the layout, the more spacious first floor went to the in-laws. We took the slightly smaller second floor with a balcony. The entrances were separate. Next to the in-laws' entrance was a staircase that led to our own entrance. The in-laws were planning to move in April of the following year. They wanted to bring some of their furniture and clothes during the holiday season before the new year. So we suggested celebrating New Year together. Brian said he was free starting the 28th, so even if they arrived on the 30th, we would have 2 days to settle in. We thought everything would be set by the night of the 31st if all 4 of us worked together, but only the stuff arrived on the 29th. The in-laws didn't show up until the evening of the 31st. Brian apologized, explaining that Megan had refused to come until the last minute. Megan saw the unopened boxes and said, "Oh, you left them like that?" We had considered unpacking but decided against it after discussing with Richard. When Richard explained, Megan lazily twirled her hair and said, "You could have unpacked." The unpackaging didn't finish that day. We had planned to dine in the spacious living room on the first floor but had to settle for our second floor home. The in-laws seemed to enjoy the meal and they relaxed in our living room afterward. Brian kept saying, "We need to unpack," but Megan said she was super tired from the move and just lounged on our sofa watching the New Year countdown on TV. With Megan unwilling to help, the three of us went to the in-laws side to finish unpacking. When we came back to our place to toast the new year, Megan was gone. We found her sleeping in our bedroom, still dressed. Both the living room and bedroom TVs were on, and she had helped herself to the champagne and mixed nuts I had set aside for toasting. Brian apologized, saying,
Megan must have been really tired from the move. We did unpack right away, so please be understanding.
I knew it wasn't Brian's fault. We let him sleep in our bedroom, and Richard and I slept in the living room. The next morning, Megan was the last to wake up, and Brian. To our surprise, after getting dressed, Megan told us she was going to meet some friends in Boston and quickly left while we were still unpacking. Brian was understandably upset about this, so ironically, Richard and I ended up calming him down. Late that night, Megan came back slightly tipsy and without any explanation, went straight to our bedroom and fell asleep. Angered by this as well, Brian said he was going to sleep on the sofa at in-laws' house and stormed out. The next day, Brian left to visit an executive in Boston who had helped him in the past. Megan woke up later and also went out with friends. Somehow, Megan returned in the evening with a cheerful Brian. Richard and I had managed to finish unpacking after the in-laws left, and Brian seemed pleased with the progress. We had mostly set up the in-laws' bedroom too, so they slept there that night, allowing me to finally sleep in my own bed. The next day, the in-laws headed back to New Orleans. After seeing them off, I felt suddenly exhausted. Lying on the living room sofa, Richard apologized.
Mom is too free-spirited. I didn't think she would be like this. Sorry for making you do all the work, Christina. But once they have moved, they'll be living separately, so we won't have to deal with this anymore.
I was frustrated with Megan, who had a habit of imposing her will on others, but I didn't complain, figuring it wouldn't matter much after the move. However, Megan's selfish behavior only escalated. When spring arrived, along with Brian's job transfer, the in-laws moved in, and again, I was expected to help unpack. About 2 months after they moved in, Megan started coming over to our house. Usually, after sending Richard off and finishing breakfast cleanup, Megan would arrive around 10 a.m., all dolled up. "Hey, I'm heading out today. Please take care of the house. Here's the key," she would say, handing me the key to her house before leaving. I reluctantly ended up doing the chores for their home too. Megan would typically return around 6 p.m., nonchalantly greet Brian, and retrieve the key from me. At first, it was just once a week, but Megan gradually increased the frequency of her visits, making me more and more responsible for their housework. One day, I told her, "I have my own chores. I can't do this anymore." Megan walked into my house, looked around, and said, "Everything's clean, isn't it? You get your chores done so quickly, Christina. You can handle ours easily," and left the key on the living room table before heading out. I decided it wasn't a good idea to bring this up directly with Brian, so I talked to Richard. After apologizing for Megan's behavior, he said,
"You can ignore Mom's demands."
"I can't just ignore them," I protested. Finally, Richard agreed to address the issue with Megan when Brian was around. They planned to talk during a meal on Brian's day off. As usual, Megan pretended to be engrossed in the TV while I was cooking. In the presence of Brian, Megan acts as if she is doing normal housework. During dinner, Richard said,
"Mom, it's okay if you go out, but don't push your housework onto Christina."
Brian immediately rebuked Megan.
"Are you really doing that? We had an agreement not to be a burden to Richard and Christina. They have their own lives too, you know?"
Then Megan burst into tears and said, "I want to help with housework too, but my back has been hurting lately. It's hard to bend over. That's why I've been asking Christina to help. I thought it would make it awkward for her if I were around, so I went out. I'm sorry, Christina." That's a blatant lie about her back hurting. Why? Because just last weekend, taking advantage of Brian being away on a business trip, Megan went out to play golf with her friends. People with bad backs don't go playing golf. But Brian, who was unaware of all this, said,
"I see. I didn't know your back was bad. Christina, could you help with the chores until she feels better? I'll of course pay you extra for it."
Brian's anger seemed to evaporate as he became concerned for Megan and turned to me for help. Richard seemed to understand as well, saying,
"Oh, so that's why."
Once we were alone, back at our house next door, I told him Megan's back pain was a lie.
"But Dad said he's giving us money and you have always managed, so why not? We can be a bit laid back about our own stuff. I'll even tell Dad to make sure you get paid well. so you can buy whatever you want. Just give me a little more allowance in return," he said with a smile.
Something we realized after parents-in-law moved here is that the father-son duo, Brian and Richard, are too kind-hearted. They have basic common sense and show anger when it's violated, but their kindness means they easily forgive Megan's filmsy excuses. Megan knew this, so she told convincing lies to get Brian and Richard on her side. Once Brian started giving her an allowance for housework, she began to neglect her chores even more. She used to dump chores on me when Brian was out, saying things like, "I can't move because my back hurts," or "I can't get up, my back hurts and I feel sick," pushing me to do all the housework from morning till night. Oblivious to Megan's lies, Brian would say, "Sorry, Christina," and head out. After Brian left, Megan would shower, dress up, and go out without saying a word. By this time, I had been given a duplicate key to the in-laws' house. When she returned before Brian did, she would complain about the dinner I made. "Isn't this too little? Can't you make more dishes? You're getting an allowance. Don't slack off. My dress is wrinkled. Iron it properly. The bathroom isn't clean yet. I wanted to shower before Brian comes back. Come on, give me a massage. I'm tired," she would say whenever she wanted. She really seemed to think of me as an actual housekeeper, yet when Brian returned, she would put on a facade saying, "This is delicious. Christina, your housework is more meticulous than mine," and Brian and Richard were completely oblivious to Megan's attitude. Even when I complained to Richard, all he said was, "You can ignore unreasonable demands." I had reached my breaking point with Megan. I thought the only way left was to secretly film Megan when Brian and Richard weren't around and show them the evidence. Just when I thought this, an unexpected opportunity arose. It was the day Brian returned from a business trip. As usual, Megan saw him off and went on a trip saying she was going sightseeing with friends. She returned earlier than Brian, as always, and told me to give her a massage because she was tired. "I'm the one who's tired after doing all the housework, not you, Megan," I thought, but saw a red mark on the back of her neck while massaging her shoulders. It looked like a hickey. At first, I thought Brian gave it to her and was impressed that he still had it in him in his 50s, but then, considering he had been on a business trip for about 5 days, I thought, could a hickey really last that long? Could Megan be having an affair? I found it hard to believe that Megan, who had lived in New Orleans her whole life, would have so many friends in Boston. That's why I hired a private investigator to look into it. Luckily, I knew Megan's daily routine, and she always went on trips when Brian was out of town for work, so following her was easy. Long story short, Megan was cheating, and she was being pretty bold about it. Within 2 weeks of hiring the investigator, I had my answer. Seeing photos and videos of Megan in compromising situations left me speechless. She was holding hands with a man her own age as they entered a hotel. The pictures even showed her passionately kissing the guy at the hotel bar. It was riskier than I had imagined. I was shaking with anger, not just because she was neglecting her housework to have an affair, but because she was betraying someone as kind as Brian. She had the audacity to betray Brian while he worked hard to provide for us. I couldn't let her get away with this. Her birthday was coming up, so I decided that would be the day to put my plan into action. Why don't we throw Megan a surprise party? When I proposed the idea, Brian seemed thrilled. Here's the plan. Brian would tell Megan he had to work that day and encourage her to go out for a birthday dinner with the other man. "I'll invite her out to dinner and we can surprise her at the hotel," I told Brian. Brian believed me and pretended to go to work that evening. Megan, after taking longer than usual to get ready, finally left the house saying how disappointed she was that she couldn't spend her birthday with Brian. I had the investigator tail her, and it seemed she did go to the usual hotel where she met her lover. Had she gone somewhere else, I would have had to quickly notify Brian about a change of plans, but luckily, she chose the usual place. As soon as I got word that Megan had arrived at the hotel, I headed there by taxi. We have to expose the truth to Brian before she goes into the room with that man. By the time I arrived, Brian had also sent me a message saying he was there. I knew where they were sitting from the investigator, so I told Brian we still have time before our reservation and led him to the bar. While walking to the bar, Brian was excited, asking things like, "Do you think Megan will like this gift?"
Do you think the surprise will go well?
It pained me to see his happiness, but I had to go through with my plan for his sake. Since I knew what Megan was wearing, I was able to identify her from behind. I chose a spot where we could clearly see her back. From there, I thought I'd be able to see Megan and the man as they moved, and sure enough, I could. About 20 minutes after sitting down with Brian, Megan, probably thinking about moving to a hotel room, wrapped her arm around the man's and started to work off in a flirty manner. I had a perfect view of Megan's profile. I glanced at Brian, wondering what if he hadn't noticed. Brian was staring, lost for words. Then after about 5 seconds of shock, Brian ran after Megan, catching her by the arm near the bar's exit. What? Megan looked stunned.
Megan, what are you doing here? Who is this guy?
Oh,
What's going on?
the surprised one was the man. Brian, demanding an explanation, told the man,
She's my wife. I need to talk to her. Sorry, but you should go home now.
and walked out of the bar, still holding Megan's arm. I quickly settled the bill for Brian and me and followed them. In the taxi back, Megan seemed to realize her situation and kept saying, "It's not like that, Brian." Brian said nothing. When we got home, Brian told me,
I would like for you to go home too, Christina.
I said, okay, but concerned that kind-hearted Brian might get fooled by Megan again, I discreetly went to the in-laws' house with the incriminating photos and hid to observe their living room.
What was that about?
"You're misunderstanding." Megan began making excuses to an angry Brian. "I went out drinking because celebrating my birthday alone was boring. I had too much to drink and the guy next to me offered to help. He said he would walk me to a taxi because I was stumbling." Brian seemed close to being fooled by Megan's smooth excuses. I couldn't keep quiet. Bursting into the living room, I yelled, "Don't be fooled, Brian. Megan is having an affair and it's not the first time she's met that man." "What? Christina, don't say things you don't understand. Eavesdropping is the worst." "Brian, look at this." I handed Brian the evidence photos. "What's this bunch of papers?" Megan, who had been confident, started to panic when she realized what was handed to Brian were photos. "No, I didn't do it. These pictures are fake." Megan was yelling this, but Brian was quietly looking through the photos one by one. After seeing them all, he shouted,
You're the worst, Megan. Do you even realize what you have done?
"I told you, it's not me. These pictures are photoshopped." Megan argued but started to cry at Brian's words.
How could Christina Photoshop pictures of you with a guy you just met today?
"I was lonely. You're always busy with work." She tried to master her usual crocodile tears. Brian just silently stared at her. Just when it seemed like Brian might fall for Megan's act again, Richard, who had just come home from work, entered the living room.
Oh, is Christina here? I came looking for her because she wasn't home. Wait, why is Mom crying?
Wordlessly, Brian handed the photos to Richard. Megan tried to snatch them back, but Richard was quicker.
What's this? As you can see, it looks like Megan has been having an affair.
"It's not what it looks like. The devil made me do it, Richard. You understand, right?" As Megan tried to cling to Richard, he swatted her away.
Don't touch me.
Megan collapsed in exaggerated tears. Brian then said forcefully,
Get out.
"I won't. Absolutely not. Please forgive me, okay? She repeated, but Brian ignored her. Megan must have realized that saying anything more was futile. She got up weakly and started packing her things. Finally, she yelled at Brian, "Fine. He listens to me and only loves me. I'm happier with him," and stormed out of the house, but it seemed she couldn't get in touch with the other man. It seems like he thought Megan was single and vanished before getting slapped with alimony for the affair. Megan returned the next day and tearfully apologized to Brian, saying, "I'm sorry." This time, it wasn't her exaggerated sobbing ad. As she left the house, she seemed genuinely remorseful. Still, Brian didn't forgive Megan. He changed the locks on their house that same day and kicked her out for good. Half a year has passed since then, and my parents-in-law have divorced. Megan was adamant about not divorcing, saying things like, "I'll fight it in court." But since she was 100% at fault, she couldn't get a lawyer to take her case seriously, so they divorced. There was no alimony claim against Megan and likewise no division of property. Since I was the one who initiated their divorce indirectly, I apologized to Brian for it.
He thanked me, saying, "I'm glad you told me. I didn't know she was that kind of woman. Thanks to you, Christina, I found out."
When he found out I had used a private investigator, he asked,
"Do you know who the guy is?"
I did. So when I told him, Brian said he met the guy. A graduate student who thought Megan was a single 40-year-old. He profusely apologized, saying he has no idea she was married. Brian chose not to demand alimony from the guy as long as he never met with Megan again. The man agreed, saying,
"I had no intention of meeting her again, even if she became single."
Megan, who had been living off Brian's credit card, was struggling to make ends meet after being thrown out without any division of property. She regularly showed up near our place asking Brian and Richard for forgiveness and even for money. I have also been approached a few times with Megan asking me to help them reconcile. Brian, now fed up with Megan, sold the house that was under mortgage and bought a new one elsewhere. Both Brian and Richard considered moving out but decided against it, as I had no issue with kind-hearted Brian, and it would be hard for him to live alone. Since moving to the new place, Megan hasn't bothered us and we're living happily. Brian always compliments me on my housekeeping, and ever since finding out that I'm pregnant last month, both Richard and Brian have been helping out more around the house, while my first pregnancy and the upcoming birth do make me anxious. The stress-inducing Megan is gone, and with kind Richard and Brian around, I think everything will be okay.